In these times, words like shadow work and alchemy are so often bandied about, particularly if you are in the world of change work. And often they're used without perhaps lots of training, study, immersion into what's really there. And so, without that true understanding of what alchemy represents, it can become yet another place for us to project our unmet needs. And therefore, unless that's made conscious, it really is the antithesis of what is required in the work of alchemy. In this conversation with William Apple, one of my dearest friends and someone I've learned so much from, we dive into all things shadow alchemy, what's really meant by it, what it requires of us, and why we might really devote to it. Let's dive in. Hello, William. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure entirely. And this is possibly one of our mutual favourite topics, I'd say. Probably
hmm
something that we, one way or another, speak most about. Would you say?
I would agree, yes.
Hmm. And so we often say that we have conversations and then think, oh, this is one of those ones that if we'd recorded it, it would be, wonderful to share with others. No pressure,
Right,
but let's
right.
now intentionally have one of those conversations and record it and share it.
Yeah, agreed.
So we are going to be talking about all things alchemy, what some people may describe as shadow alchemy, the kind of popularization of that term, um, and all sorts of other things that just arise as we explore that. But let's start with um, really defining what we mean by that. What is meant by alchemy, like psychological alchemy, you could say.
Sure.
Um, how would you describe that?
Well, yeah, the way that I would describe alchemy is certainly going to be more in its traditional sense, though it's sort of, like you just said, it's sort of woven in with um, the reality of or sort of what seems to be more of the empirical reality of what alchemy was always trying to sort of point us towards in the traditional sense. But in short, and that's a lot based on sort of Jung's work and his predecessors. But alchemy in the traditional sense was always about turning lead into gold, right? And that's the general sort of baseline of where people start with that conversation. And so then the question has always been, what is the lead? What is the gold? And one of the things that Jung did in his well, throughout his whole career, but certainly much more in his later life, when it comes to the conversation of alchemy, was he seemed to really pinpoint what those ancient alchemists were really talking about, which was a lot of psychological content. And so, in short, when we're talking about alchemy, um, in its sort of traditional sense, and the reason also too, I think maybe it's important to say this as well, that one of the things about alchemy is that the text that we have on alchemy largely is written in metaphor, turning lead to, for example. In the traditional sense, the metaphor that was occurring was largely due to a lot of it was political reasons, other things. And so what Jung did, what Jung brought to the table was an analysis of those processes. And so it's hard to go back to those original source texts without the subjective contextual framework, if you will, meaning the personal input, like talking to somebody who was writing those texts. Um, Without speaking to them, largely it's just interpretation, right? What Jung did is he took that and he started to notice in his own analysis through psychoanalysis or analytical psychology. He noticed that in his own sort of passion and study of alchemy, that he was seeing common themes, whether it was coming up in dreams or whatever, in the analysis with working with individuals. And through that process came to find that so much of what is going on naturally and internally within the individual, which he would later, coin this concept of the process of individuation, that everything that was going on in those spaces and in the analysis and in the psychological content of that was alchemical processes that were going on. And so I say all that to sort of, again, give context of why it's important, why Jung's work is important to this topic. But ultimately, alchemy in the traditional sense and based on the analysis of Jung and again others is the recognition of an internal, generally unconscious process that's occurring. And how do we become conscious with that process to such a degree that we begin refining the material within ourselves that's sort of rough around the edges? We've had a conversation about fantasy, etc., fantasy making. How do we refine that in a conscious and intentional way? And when we ask that question and we look at alchemy, alchemy seems to have those answers in the sense that, but again, in these sort of metaphorical, symbolic ways. And so, in short, alchemy is the process of becoming conscious of our own natural inclination towards individuation
Mm.
and becoming in harmony with what that individuation process is wanting of us, which, alchemically speaking, because of its intentionality and its conscientiousness, puts us in what we would call an athanor, a container, by which we are then setting a fire underneath that athanor, this container, and burning away that sort of unrefined material into what alchemy would call the vapor. And that vapor is the distilled aspects of ourselves that help to pull out, oh, well, this, for example, this symbol of such and such, whatever it is, contained this within me when I put it under the heat and created a container by which I could conscious and intentionally look at it, examine, have an analysis of it. When I examined that symbol, what came out of it was a new material, and that new material is likely a new symbol of some sort. And so then we take that new symbol and begin working with it, and that's the process of alchemy, I think, in the most traditional and mostly empirical way of framing it. Yeah.
Mm. There's there's much of what you said there that really explains why this notion of alchemy and shadow work has so caught people's attention and imagination, because as you
Mm,
say, this is something that it, the from what we can understand, that kind of what we could say is like a framework model of alchemy, much of that is kind of taking place, albeit not always consciously. Um,
generally, yes.
as you
Generally not
say, there's
consciously.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
movement naturally anyway towards
Yes.
wholeness, towards individuation. And
Yes.
so that's I guess you could say, like, the material for that is already arising with us. And it doesn't take long for us to kind of hear snippets of things related to working with it intentionally for us for it
Mm,
to make sense. Like, the alchemy
yes.
itself is an archetype that is kind of like there alive for us, and as soon as we start to get a glimpse of it, I think there's something, it's like that in itself provides this sense of like, there's something here for me. It can
Hmm.
like call us towards it. And as you say, without the, then conscious intention to create the crucible for it, there's probably limited alchemy possible. But it's like the raw ingredients are already there, and there is like a movement in that direction, which then, as I say, for me, it explains why it's so kind of captured the attention of many people, kind of, when you say like the wider change work industry. It makes sense why it's
Yes.
happening.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. There's an inkling. All symbols have contain within them. We could call them archetypes as well. They all contain within them to speak poetically for a second. They all contain within them a jewel that's very shiny that we go, oh, that calls to me in some way, shape, or form. That
Mm,
resonates with me in some way, shape, or form. And so it makes sense that alchemy is sort of a general topic talking point in today's general nomenclature has become so popular because of there's this a large movement and emphasis on sort of personal development. And so it makes sense that there's a natural move over the last, 2 or 3 decades for individuals to have been moving towards this topic of alchemy because of the jewel that is contained within it.
mm.
Now, and I know this is sort of like part of what we might be talking about later, but that is to a large degree why it's something largely our interactions with alchemy in that way, or anything in that way that sort of touch, whether we're talking about shadow or personas or any of those things, largely what resonates with it is the fantasy of our unmet needs.
Mm,
And so that's it's this really wonderful initiation when we have that sense of, oh, there's something there, there's something really lovely there. But that's just when the work's beginning. But oftentimes, for a lot of people, that stops there, where it's like that felt really good to have that, and then it's just a lot of more fantasy making on fantasy making with what occurred psychologically in those moments, as opposed to going in and looking at it a little more clearly and more
mm.
objectively, responsibly even.
Yeah, the fantasy of doing the work, which, you know, simultaneously is kind of in the way of really doing the work potentially.
Generally,
Obviously,
yeah. Well,
yeah.
and on that note, real quick, I think I'll say this too because this is coming in sort of solidly, where it's like I think an important aspect of the traditional sense of alchemy that is really, really, and traditional, even in the empirical nature of the process of individuation, is that everything about alchemy is moving you towards crucifixion. It's moving you consciously towards death, right? And that's not something that our ego really is comfortable with. And so as a result of that, yeah, when we come into contact with the concept of alchemy, and we come into contact with symbols associated with alchemy, whether it's, I mean, this is a big part of it, for example, like polarity teachings and masculine and feminine, these are sort of alchemical
Mm,
esoteric conversations. But generally, instead of really understanding what that means, we project upon it our unmet needs, the fantasies of what we as an oppressed child, which gets into a larger conversation, but an oppressed internal child, our inner child, what does it feel in opposite, like what is it, what can it project upon those symbols that helps that oppressed child to feel safe? And of course, the real nature of alchemy is death. So anything that's related to that is going to be avoided and bypassed. And it's going to be
mm.
made, we're going to naturally have an inclination towards creating whatever we want about alchemy to make us feel safe, as opposed to really embracing sort of the dangers of what is really embedded in
Mm.
alchemy and what it really means. So, anyways, I just want to say that out loud because I think that's really important for just the general conversation. Yeah.
Yes, it really is. So it feels like we're kind of moving towards what we could describe as like the shadow of shadow work, or the shadow
Sure.
of alchemy. And before we started recording, we were musing that there's kind of, you could see like two ends of a shadow pole here. One is we're starting to touch upon this like an illusion, like what we project alchemy to mean,
Yes.
and engaging with it that way, which I think there's a bit more to say on that. And then at the other end, and this has certainly been much of my own experience, a bypassing even of the need for it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, I come from, originally when I sort of first began the path, as it were, it was a much more a kind of like moving towards this sort of non-dual way of experiencing self and the world, and sort of letting
Mm.
go of attachments, letting go of a sense of self, and without really this understanding, like kind of like the only way is through. And in
Hmm.
order for that ever to be anything approaching a reality, it needs to be kind of going through the stuff that is
Hmm.
genuinely in the way of that to enter the shadow
Yes.
to do the alchemy. And so
Yes.
it feels like this are kind of, on the one hand, in more recent years, this kind of like real like rush and like grasping at like, oh my god. And I think even the word alchemy just sounds amazing as well, which probably like doesn't help here. It's just like
Sure.
everyone
Yeah.
wants a bit of
Yeah.
alchemy. And so
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
kind of like jumping on doing what people are thinking, that thinking it's alchemy, and on the other hand thinking there's no need for it, and it's just this antiquated idea, or probably really feeling, as you say, subconsciously, the danger of going there.
Right.
And either end is probably not actually doing the thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting thing on this topic because, or this, what you're pointing to there around what's actually occurring, et cetera, because there's actually quite a lot of complexity there. And what I mean by that is that if we acknowledge again, if we go back to Jung for a second, and if we acknowledge what Jung was talking about with alchemy and the process of individuation, there's a reality that the process of individuation is naturally running through our systems. It's never not doing that. But what we
Mm,
tend to have as an ego is an unconsciousness of that. And and so there's a reality that even in the fantasy making, and I say that with like the pH of that, right? So the fantasy making, or even just well, yeah, more so the fantasy making with pH, is that even with that, there's a reality that that's also a part of alchemy, right?
mm,
But the important part of alchemy and how the ego interacts with it is that we are conscious and accountable and accepting of the mess and the muck of that, right? I mean, as the alchemical saying is that in the filth it will be found, which is it is the gold. And so there's in the filth, if you will, of the mess of our fantasy making around the concept of alchemy, whether that's people making things up, right? Just completely out of left field and based on their own projections and their fantasies and their shadow of that material. All of that is also a part of alchemy, but it's not a conscientious
mm,
intentionality with alchemy when that's occurring. So yeah.
mm. What having spent several years in the change work coaching
Sure.
industry, which again started to this notion of like, oh, just we can just start doing shadow work, we can just start doing
Right.
alchemy, which has sort of been occurring over recent years. Is there anything else that you would name in terms of like the ways that you see that show up, things to look out for? Again, because so much of
Mm,
this is, very innocently done, really well
mm,
intended. It
sure.
ultimately, as you say, is all included in alchemy. I think it's
Yes.
helpful to kind of name how that might show up so people can recognize that. So people can
Mm.
recognize, oh, and that's part of, again, becoming conscious, becoming accountable.
My sort of yellow flag, if you will, or even a red flag with any of these conversations around, say, I mean, the big popular one, I think, a large popular one right now is like shadow work, and another one would be polarity teachings.
Hmm.
Those two things, or sorry, I mean, like any of those things, the sort of yellow and red flags that I have around those, and this is where people, I think, find the most, tend to find the most aversion to the suggestion. But of course, if there's an aversion to the suggestion, maybe where the work is to a large degree, because there's something that's
Mm.
afraid, defending against that. There's a fantasy that might die if we are honest about that truth to some
Mm.
degree. And so, but again, I say that with the caveat being, and a gentle understanding that there's a reality that, again, there's no rightness or wrongness here. There really isn't.
Mm.
But if we're really talking about alchemy and approaching it with an accountability to it. It largely is when people are talking about things, shadow, in my work, I mean, specifically a lot of what it is that I do is what I would call this inner child work. Any of those top or polarity teachings, which is polarity teachings, or the concept of polarity, for example, is rooted in deeply esoteric things. For example, the Hermetic law of the law of gender, right? It's rooted in there, but it's been bastardized because it's just been taken and ran away with in the imaginary playlands of the child, again, imagining its safe
Mm.
places, not appreciating the historicity of the teaching in itself. Where did it come from? And who were the individuals that worked diligently to create it as sort of an empirical thing? When we appropriate it in that way, and when I mean that appropriation is like doing that without permission, doing that, taking a concept, whether that's, this alchemical conversation or anything from any other culture, when we take that without doing the due diligence and the work necessary by which the individuals who cultivated those ideas in the first place through long lineage and history of empirical research and analysis in whatever version of that it is in the culture that, manifested it, if we don't have, if we haven't done the work necessary by which that lineage would pass the torch to us, then we have appropriated and we're just make believing at that point.
Mm.
And that's a yellow or red flag and so when practically what that looks like is when you come into contact with someone, where did you learn this from? Where did you get this information from? What's your lineage and how far does it go back? I recognize in today's day and age, that's almost like a sort of a boogeyman that we don't want to talk about, where your lineage, we don't need lineage. But the truth of it is we really do, especially when we're talking, like, for example, the concept of shadow is largely produced by Jung's work. But
Mm.
most people that I talk to when they say the shadow have never read Jung, ever,
Mm.
right? And so that's a huge disconnect from the source material by which you are now appropriating so that you can go play make believe. And that's a yellow or red flag.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, I think what we're talking about here is so important, and there's some synchronicity because I was talking to a client yesterday, and she was asking me what the terms dharma and karma mean.
Mm,
And I posted about this briefly because I just got out some homegrown parsnips that my neighbour had given me. And
mm,
they were kind of there on my chopping board, ready to chop to make soup. And
mm,
as I was answering her, I did this kind of big preamble before I answered her questions, basically saying much of what you've just said. And I was using, because
mm.
these parsnips are there, I was using those as a metaphor and saying, these parsnips make sense within the context. They were grown on local land by my neighbor who I, know and love. And then he
Mm-hmm.
has, tended them, nourished them, taken care of them, pulled them out of the ground, then brought them to me. They're now here on my chopping board, and I'm kind of, about to then, be intimate with them whilst I, prepare them and stuff, make soup out of them.
Right.
Versus if these were, plucked out of the ground, flown across the world, clean, skin, chopped up, put into plastic, put into a shop, someone else buys it.
Mm-hmm.
They might at the end of it think they know the parsnip, but do they know the parsnip? Do they know that
Right. Right.
parsnip
Right.
without any of the context that it was grown in? My sense
Right.
is like they know a bit of the parsnip. They know it, they can recognize it as a parsnip, but they don't know that parsnip. They don't, because they
Right.
don't know the context.
Right.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's that we miss over and over again in this, like, gosh, that sounds, because these are, again, powerful ideas. They're archetypes that already kind of are in our psyches. It's no wonder that we're like, oh my goodness, this makes sense, this concept in this instance of dharma and karma or shadow
Right.
work, whatever the thing is. It kind of already is alive, somewhat within us. So it's totally
Yes.
natural that we think, oh, I know this, I can have this. But without the context, is like, do we really?
Yeah. Well, so much of in the
The soup was
relationships that
delicious,
we,
by the way.
yeah, I love. Was it just parsnip soup, or is
It
it
was spiced
parsnips?
parsnip soup. I've just had it for
Oh,
my
I love
lunch.
that. Yeah, I love parsnip
I would
soup.
give you some, but
We're
another
a couple
time.
thousand miles away. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. There's, oh, where was I going? One second, let me see if I can get it back. Oh yeah. So like in relationships, right? There's like so much of, and especially in the Western context, I can't speak to an Eastern context in the sense of sort of Europe over, right? Like, but generally in a Western context, there's a conversation around relationships, etc., right? And how do we learn how to meet someone, right? How do we really meet another person? And this gets into the same sort of analogy, right? Where oftentimes the way we interact with other people, and this goes back again to our conversation about fantasy versus fantasy a
Which,
while
by the
ago, but
way, if anyone's listening, I would really recommend go listen to that if you haven't already after listening to this, because it will provide some extra useful
extra
context for it.
context, yeah,
Mm.
agreed, yeah.
In fact,
But
both of our previous episodes.
oh yeah, agreed. There's a reality that um, oftentimes, and as there's a psychoanalyst called Jacques Lacan, who I actually think I
Mm.
mentioned in that conversation, where a lot of his analysis, one of the big takeaways that I've taken from his work is this concept of other, and do we ever really see other, right? And generally the case is no. We see the fantasy of other. We see
Mm.
other in equal proportion to our unmet needs. And the same goes for alchemy or any of these large esoteric concepts that are um, sort of meant and designed to help us in the psycho-spiritual journey of life. And when that's the case, like, are we seeing the parsnip, right? Are we seeing the dharma, the concept of dharma or karma or shadow? Are we really seeing it for what it is empirically, or are we seeing it as the imaginings and our projections and the sublimations of our conditioning and programming? Are we seeing the fantasy making of all of that? And generally, we're seeing that. And it's
Mm.
like, that's like an empirical truth that we like is almost irrefutable. I don't know of any case where you could refute that. And so that's what we're asking, or that's what I'm asking when I talk about these concepts is let's be accountable for that. Like, and it's not like
Mm.
again, it's
That
not a right or a
includes that,
wrong.
yes.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's not a right or a wrong thing. And it's not about you being a good person or a bad person. It's just like, let's own that. Let's just be honest about the fact that that's occurring, and if we could do that, then we're going to have a much deeper intimacy with a person or a concept. If we can acknowledge, like, I'm fantasizing about this thing, and I'm going to be honest about that, whether that again is a concept or a person, and that creates
Mm.
a deeper level of intimacy that is lacking if we don't do that. So yeah,
Yeah, I love that. A really strange example just came to mind from this morning. My where's he gone? Oh, he's down there. My Dachshund Huxley
yeah,
um, just walked over there, and it brought this into my mind. So this morning we woke up. Dachshunds are now known; they're absolutely renowned for giving really good side eye, and so it's like
they
you'll
do.
see if you Google. In fact, I started googling or something like, "Why do Dachshunds give?" And then it was like immediate top answer: side eye. Just so overdoing it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and so I started this morning. Huxley was like starting the day giving everyone a side eye, and I was asking the family, why do you think Dachshunds give good side eye? It was so interesting hearing everyone's like kind of different. Oh, because he's got a really long
Mm,
nose, because he's kind of like a fish, and they're on the side of his head, because he's got a
mm-hmm.
small face and big. Like, everyone had a different reason for why Dachshunds might give good side eye, and it just came to mind as an example where we don't tend to even ask that normally. We just project when a human does that kind of like quite, almost like a side eye is a bit of a sort of sense of, how would you describe it?
Questioning, like a sort of a judgy questioning of
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
so we tend to project that on when
To the Dutch,
Dachshunds
yeah,
do
to Dutch,
that. We
yeah,
think that's what
100%, yeah.
they probably are, but we tend to project
They're
that.
probably judging the crap out of us, absolutely.
We tend to project that on the Dachshunds, and
Right,
we don't often stop to be accountable for the fact that that projection, we're projecting this
exactly.
human notion onto
Yes,
the Dachshund instead
yes,
of asking what is actually going on there. Like, what is
yes,
beyond my projections of what
yes,
it might mean, and the fact it looks cute and it blah blah
yes,
blah? what actually is going on that's making the dash do the side eye. It just
It's
came
so
to
good.
mind as like a very simple example, but it's like in those asking those questions, we start to get
Yes.
the sense of like all of this projection we're doing all the time, everywhere.
Yeah. I actually, and it's, I love the fact that you are encouraging that, right? That questioning, because I actually just wrote about this yesterday where I said something to the effect of, in equal proportion to the questions that we're asking, I think this is how I said it, in equal proportion to the questions that we're asking, um, judgment, yeah, judgment and assumption would be removed in equal proportion to that, right? So like if we're asking lots of questions about a thing that we're experiencing, I just butchered the thing that I wrote. But if we're
Yeah.
asking a lot of questions, right? And if our default is to ask questions about anything that's given to us, it's a very Socratic approach, which I love. Socrates is
Me too.
very
Yeah.
important in my work. Yeah, if we're asking lots of questions, there's more likely a case that we're actually going to see the thing for what it is. We're going to love it for what it is, as opposed to project upon it. We're going to have less projections
Mm,
upon the thing because questions just, they naturally go to a place where our assumptions and our projections have to be dismantled if we're going to ask questions.
mm.
Anything else other than a question leads to almost an assumption, right? Now, I want to be clear,
Yes.
like I say
Mm,
that as also too as a scientist in my own right, where it's very important to understand that questions can lead us to empirical data that thereby gives us footholds to which to move towards something in deeper intimacy empirically. So it's important to recognize that questions are just going to lead us to away from, or to nothingness. Well, actually they would. But that's the point, is that like, actually I'm getting off I'm getting off topic if I keep going that way. So yes, I love the fact that you allowed for questions to show up around the conversation of the side eye with the dog, because there's so much human centric bias, or just bias in general, that gets projected outwardly. And if we're asking questions about it, then we're dismantling that. And I think that's
mm.
lovely. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So, gosh, time is flying by. So there's part of it. We may need to come and do a part two on this. I mean, hey, it's a
Sure.
huge topic, and as we
Sure.
suspected, we've got lots that we want to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
But for the moment, I feel it'd be helpful to perhaps talk a little bit more about. We've kind of almost slightly talked about what alchemy isn't, albeit it kind of is
Right.
everything, but
Yes.
the projections on alchemy versus what it really is. So perhaps
Right.
I wonder if there's more we could say around what it actually is, what's happening, what's going on as we make that
What's the practicum,
path
so
more
to speak?
conscious. And then I
Yeah.
think let's see if we can end with something that then is helpful for someone listening, because again, this is a very natural thing that people want to engage with consciously.
Sure.
And so I think if we can end with something that's helpful in that way, that would be good too. So let's start
Agreed.
with, what else do you feel would be useful to talk about in terms of, as we are consciously entering into alchemy, what does that look like? What does that entail?
For me, in the way that I approach it with, clients slash students that I work with intentionally with this, is always back to basics. One of the things that I give as an analogy is, I was in martial arts for a very long time, and I still am sort of indirectly involved. And when I have this anecdotal story of when I first started learning martial arts, of course I was young and wanted to learn all the fancy kicks and punches and wanted to be the best at it and all that stuff, all these grandiosities. And my teacher was wonderful enough to go, if you want to learn how to do the complex thing, you have to master the basics 10,000 times. This is also from in many ways a teaching from Bruce Lee. And so that's true with everything. And so we have,
Mm,
in order to do that, we have to define what's the basics. And the basics are, that I start with everybody with, is what is conditioning and programming? What are coping and defense mechanisms? and how do we relate to them? How do we project them onto things? How do we not cultivate them? How do we develop them? Why do we develop them? Right? Which gets into that concept right there, or those topics right there, I should say, is in ways an initiation into what we would call the personal shadow, or the inner child, or the wounded inner child more specifically. Because all of that, the coping and defense mechanisms, the conditioning and programming that sort of fuels those coping and defense mechanisms, and how habitually we manifest them, um, even when, like, one of the things that I say in the work that I offer people is that even when we have developed new sort of more functional ways, if you will, more conscientious ways by which to engage with life or the world around us, largely what's just happening is that we found better coping and defense mechanisms that we prefer, right? That the other ones weren't working anymore. We've just developed new ones. So that means that so much of how we're still, even when we're more engaged, we feel more alive in our systems, we feel more safe in our systems. Largely what's happening there is we've just created more coping and defense mechanisms. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if we don't have an intimacy with those basics, then uh, we're not really being honest about the full process of what it means to get in touch with alchemy, because those coping and defense mechanisms are likewise biases, and along with the conditioning and programming that's fueling them are likewise biases, and all of that impacts our ability to really engage with life as it is and not as we imagine it to be. So that's the place that I would start with anybody, honestly, with alchemy specifically, is, can you be honest? Do you know what those things are? And can you be honest and accountable for those things throughout your daily life? And for example, can you do that without shame, blame, or guilt? Can you be
Mm.
accountable for those things without being like, oh God, I just, projected something, or, oh God, like, can you do that without those things? And that's a lot of that basic work that I encourage people to consider when they're trying to approach alchemy, because if you're not conscientious of that, if you're not accepting and loving of that, then whatever gets manifested into alchemy will be a distortion of it.
Mm. You've touched on this, I believe, earlier on in this conversation, and certainly in, I think the first,
I think
I
the
can't
first
remember the
conversation I
one of the
said the same thing.
conversations we've
Yeah,
had.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think this is a really helpful distinction that, all, whilst all of this could be called shadow work, I think there is something very helpful to recognize is like the work with the inner child needs to come first, but is
Yes.
often the part that's most sort of like skipped over, bypassed, because there's almost like this
Yes.
grandiosity and like, I'm
It is
doing shadow
grandiosity.
work,
Yes.
rather than, this is my own inner child that's like,
Yeah.
dead. And there's I think for many a kind of like aversion, understandably, because it's kind of everything's set up so that the child is abandoned. It all kind of
Right.
makes sense
Yes.
and works if we
Yes.
ignore the child.
Yes.
And so I think, to as you do, you often won't even use the word shadow work when it, in the first stages is
Yes.
really
No.
focused on the inner child. And I really
Yes.
think that's so helpful, because it does create this sense of like, this is what's actually going on here, rather than
Yes.
dressing it up in this like amorphous term that can sound a little bit glamorous and a bit mysterious.
Yes. Well, and I love, yeah, and I love the way you framed it, because it helped me to, something connected about that I'll speak to here, which is that largely because, see, this is the thing, largely because there's an oppressed child within all of us. There's a reason why the hero is the savior is so important in our sort of, especially in our Western conversations. And the reason that well, no, let's stay there. Uh, the hero is so important because of the child that is oppressed, but because we're not conscious of that heroism, what ends up happening is when we go to try to work on ourselves and we're not acknowledging the child within, we seek the grandiosities of things to be the best hero we can be. And so
Mm,
if we can go, I'm doing shadow work, right? Because it's this big or whatever, then that's actually our projections, our fantasy, our grandiosity of ourselves, trying to save the child, but just not being honest about it, right? And if
mm,
we can be honest about the fact that the child comes first, then the heroisms will be dismantled. And that's a part of alchemy. It's not about just going to shadow. There are stages in this work, and it's very important to acknowledge that, because like you just said, the child has to come first, because the child in alchemy is the last thing that remains. It is the stone, it is the soul. And that's the thing we start with in our own psyche. And if we don't do that, then everything else is just fantasy and grandiosity.
Mm.
So
So I think we definitely need a part two. I mean, one of the things we wanted to get into was a conversation we were in the other day around kind of shamanism and alchemy, and the
right,
alchemy of those two things.
right,
But we definitely need to save that for the next
sure.
conversation. So a couple of things. One, I wonder if this would have been helpful for us to define right at the start, but hey, it's now, so it's perfect.
Yeah.
Um, you sort of touched on it just then. For you, well, how would you name the purpose of alchemy? What's this all about?
I mean, in its poetic form, it's about coming to empirical terms with the divine child or the God within you. That's the poetic way of saying it. And I say it's poetic because those words are symbolic. So lots of people are going to have lots of different meaning making that they're going to, project into those symbols. Um, in a grounded sort of practical way, it's just really about being honest. That's it. Like really learning how to lovingly be honest with ourselves and the world around us. And I mean, that's the nature of alchemy. It's always encouraging you to, yeah, but is it really? Like have that question in the back of your head. Is that really and not as a projection of like being defensive or, being worried about what the truth may hold. It's just going, is that true? Is that really true what I just said or what I just thought or what I just agreed to? Because that's what alchemy is asking us to do on a regular basis, is just to lovingly be honest with ourselves. That's
Mm.
I think in the most practical human sense of it, that's what it is.
I love the way you put a just there, just be honest with ourselves, when
Yeah.
probably is the most
It's the hardest
challenging
thing. Yeah,
thing
yeah.
of all to do.
Often
If you're
one of the
honest about it, William.
Yeah, no, I know, right? It is. Well, that's when we know, right? Like those, just as another thing, like there as a I often say that that you're getting closer to the truth of things, like, and I mean the truth in like an empirical sense of like how life really is. You're oftentimes getting closer to the truth when what you say and what you feel and what you think is paradoxical,
Mm.
right? Because duality, and this gets into the non-duality part of things, like practical, empirical non-duality is embodying duality, like the extremes of duality simultaneously, and the
Mm.
paradox of it. And so and so that's when we're talking about just being honest. It is so simple, right? I mean, it's like the gurus will say, the gurus will say, like, what's the greatest truth you can speak? And they will say, it is,
Mm.
right? And it's sort of the same thing where it's just being honest, right? But within that context is an immense infinitude of complexity, right? That's the reality of it. And so we know when we're saying things like that, which seem paradoxical, we're getting closer to the truth.
Mm. So, finishing up for now,
Yeah.
what for people listening that are hearing, perhaps there has been this call to alchemy, to shadow alchemy, um, and now having a sense of like, this is what it might really entail. What would you suggest? Where would you say that is a place to begin?
To start again, study what coping and defense mechanisms are and what conditioning and programming is. What is bias? What are biases? What is confirmation bias? That's another one. That's a big one, actually.
Hmm.
Those things. I study that. Like learn how that shows up in your life. Learn how you manifest it, how you project it, etc. And then if you're really wanting to get into the conversation of alchemy itself, I always go to books. I'm a reader, right? I mean, part of being an alchemist in a lot of ways is you just, I like that there was a meme that
Just
was going
read a
around.
bunch.
You just read a whole lot. Well, and it's reading and then practical application. So then you study with people, right? But there's so much of the reading part is important because it's the dismantling of that unconscious, without permission, appropriation of things, right? You're getting
Mm,
back to the context of things. So I don't. But with regards to books, and alchemy specifically, I used to suggest people reading Jung, and I don't do that anymore because, um, well, he's not easy to read, honestly. I mean, it's like a first language for me, as I said before, but it's not easy to read. I don't. I'm trying to see. I'm looking at my bookshelves and seeing if there's anything that like pops off for me that I'm going, oh, that would be a really great like book to start with that's specifically about alchemy. I think actually, you know what? I've been doing this a lot. There's a book that I'd encourage everybody to read. Actually, maybe there's two of them, but we'll start with one. Is Boundaries of the Soul by June Singer. Okay, and the reason I'm suggesting that is because she does a really lovely job. She was a Jungian, or like an analytical psychologist. She's an analyst. And the subtitle of Boundaries of the Soul is The Practice of Jung Psychology. But it gets into, like, there's chapters, and it's like the archetypes and shadow and individuation and the opposites within, which is a huge thing that gets into polarity stuff, and what is the self and psychological types, and all of these are so important to the
mm,
process of alchemy. And she does it in a relatively sort of disseminating way, down from like the density of Jung's work. And she does a really lovely job. Oh, actually, speaking of people that I think disseminates Jung so beautifully, Addiction to Perfection by Marion Woodman.
mm. Yeah,
She is
read that.
phenomenal. Like, yeah, like I think those two, I think would be a great starting place for reading. And yeah, and then just again studying what are coping and defense mechanisms, what is conditioning and programming, and what are your biases, and how are they often confirmed? Because generally we're seeking their confirmation. So,
Mm,
yeah.
beautiful. So, reluctantly, we need to draw this to a close.
Yeah, yeah, I do have to
Um,
hop off. Yeah.
where can people find out more about you and your wonderful work?
Well, I'm hopping off social media, which I think last time we said, like I knew I was on my way out. I'll be off of social media in April in general. I did start a Substack, which I had no idea about. A client and friend of mine recommended it to me, and I looked into it. I was like, I'm into that. So I am on Substack. You can find me there, and that's where I'm going to be posting just my writings and excerpts from upcoming books that I'm writing, et cetera, et cetera. And then my website is ionpsychodynamiccoaching.com. And if you are interested, now that is also going through an overhaul, so there's not anything there, so for people can book sessions with me, and that's about it. But that is where you can also find me, and you can also email me there if you have any questions about the conversation that we had here today. So
Wonderful. As ever, William, it has been a pleasure.
likewise, my dear,
Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.